I never thought survival could look so much like destruction. The moment I realized something was wrong was the night I found Michael sitting perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a molecular diagram like he'd been frozen in time. It was 2 a.m., and the fluorescent light of our shared dorm room cast him in an unnatural relief. Skin too pale, movements too precise. My name is Daniel Chen, and this is how everything fell apart. Let me backtrack a little bit. My first impression of Westbrook University was that it was intimidating, the hallways seeming to carry the weight of generations, marble floors worn smooth by decades of academic ambition, walls lined with portraits of distinguished professors, their eyes seeming to follow each new class with predatory intensity. That day we first met Helena Miller. She had stood at the podium like a surgical instrument, precise, uncompromising, absolutely purposeful. She watched us as we filed into the lecture hall. 32 brilliant minds, most of them probably more brilliant than me. But we were all desperate, all afraid. Organic chemistry, junior year, the course that would determine everything. The grading curve was merciless, we were told. Only 5 students would earn an A. The rest would be systematically cold, their medical school dreams eviscerated by a single letter grade. The first class already felt like a pressure cooker of academic desperation. Pre-med students packed into the lecture hall like survivors in a lifeboat, each knowing only a few would escape. Rumors have long been circulated about past semesters. Students who didn't make the cut found their medical school dreams crushed, their scholarships revoked, their futures evaporated. Competitive whispers detailed how Dr. Miller's previous classes had destroyed careers with a single percentage point. Some said she deliberately created an environment of psychological warfare where students would sacrifice anything, sleep, relationships, mental health, to survive. The unspoken rule was clear: perform perfectly or be discarded. Parents mortgaged homes. Students took experimental study drugs. Some even spoke of students who had transferred, only to find their academic records mysteriously tarnished. This was more than a class. This was survival. I sat in the front row. I remember my hands were already trembling before the lecture even began. Not from fear, but from a lifetime of carefully engineered expectations. My story had begun generations before I entered this classroom, with a grandfather who survived the Cultural Revolution, and parents who arrived in California with nothing but 2 suitcases, less than $200 to their name, and an unshakable belief in education as salvation. The Chen family narrative was etched in sacrifice. Education was not a path, it was a weapon, a means of survival, and I was meant to be their masterpiece, their investment, their redemption. Organic chemistry was more than a class. It was a crucible. The syllabus was an enemy. Impossible problem sets. Research requirements that demanded 60-hour weeks. Lab reports that needed to be perfect. Not just good, but absolutely flawless. Dr. Helena Miller's reputation was legendary. A brilliant researcher who had transformed departmental standards and highly regarded in her field even beyond the university walls. Some said she was responsible for weeding out the weak, preparing only the most exceptional for medical careers. Her history was as meticulously constructed as her reputation. 30 years of research, 17 groundbreaking papers, a wall of awards that spoke of extraordinary scientific achievement. Even if you did not take her classes, you would know about Helena Miller. In medical science, she once told us, adaptation is survival. The human body is not a fixed system. It is a dynamic, responsive mechanism waiting to be optimized. I understood optimization intimately. My entire life had been a careful engineering project. My parents had chosen and customized every variable. Mandarin and English lessons simultaneously from before kindergarten. Advanced mathematics before elementary school. Piano. Competitive chess. Each activity selected not for pleasure, but for potential, for edge. By the time I reached university, I was a finely calibrated machine. Exhausted, brilliant, terrified of failure. My roommate, Michael, a scholarship student from East Los Angeles, who was sat 2 rows behind me that day, represented a different type of desperation. Where I carried the weight of generational expectations, Michael carried the hopes of an entire working-class neighborhood. His mother worked 3 jobs. His younger siblings looked to him as their ticket out of generational poverty, and Michael saw this course as his only way out. His eyes were always bloodshot, his fingers perpetually stained with caffeine in desperation. "In this class," Dr. Miller announced when we were all sat down, her voice clinical and cold, "you are not students. You are competitors. Only the strongest survive." It was just like the rumors said. Dr. Miller really was ruthless about performance, and she certainly wasn't afraid of being vocal about it. What we didn't know was how literal she was about that process. The first exam arrived 3 weeks into the semester, and something began to change that day. Subtly at first, the top performers in our class began to exhibit peculiar characteristics: enhanced focus, synchronized movements, a clinical precision that went beyond normal academic excellence. I first noticed it with Michael. My roommate stopped sleeping traditional hours. Instead, he would sit perfectly still for hours and hours, eyes open but unfocused, consuming information at an impossible rate. One evening, we were studying together in our shared living room, surrounded by the typical chaos of textbooks and energy drink cans. Michael had been highlighting his organic chemistry notes when his hands suddenly went completely still. For minutes, not a blink, not a breath. His eyes fixed on a single molecular diagram, pupils dilated to an unnatural uniformity. When he finally moved, it was with a precision that felt manufactured. Each movement calculated, each motion too perfect. His notes were now color-coded with mathematical precision, not just highlighted, but color-coded in a pattern that seemed to follow some internal logic I couldn't comprehend. Stranger still, when Michael spoke, his voice had changed. The slight accent from his East Los Angeles childhood had vanished, replaced by a neutral, almost mechanical tone. "The molecular structure," he said, pointing to the diagram, "contains an inherent symmetry that most students miss." But it wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, as if he was reading from a script, as if he was no longer entirely human. I was deeply unsettled, and although I tried to reason that it was probably just fatigue, from that moment on, something began to itch at the back of my mind. Amongst all the students, late-night study sessions became ritualistic. People compared notes, shared caffeine, compared stress levels that bordered on psychological warfare. As time wore on, my roommate seemed to have stopped sleeping altogether. Whenever I stepped out of my room to get a glass of water or go to the fridge, I'd always find him there, no matter the time. And one day I caught him taking experimental study drugs. His weight had dropped. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, like something was consuming him from the inside. "It's worth it," Michael said when I finally confronted him about it, not able to watch my friend deteriorate anymore. But Michael didn't seem to hear me at all and kept muttering, "Just need to stay in the top 5. Just need to stay in the top 5. To make matters worse, the campus health center seemed complicit. Prescriptions flowed freely: Adderall, modafinil, experimental compounds with unpronounceable names. Anything to keep students functioning. Anything to keep them competitive. By midterms, the transformation became impossible to ignore. The top 5 performers seemed further altered. Their eyes had a strange, fixed quality. Their movements synchronized in unsettling ways, almost like they were no longer entirely individual. Michael, of course, was among them. His transformation had been apparent to me for a while, but to some extent, his strange behavior and appearance could have been brought on by all the drugs he was taking and the little sleep he was having. But now his transformation had entered a new phase, so bizarre that it was impossible to ignore or attribute to some generic cause. Increased muscle density, enhanced cognitive response times, a surgical precision in movement that suggested something fundamental had changed. Less human, more optimized. I decided I could leave this no longer. Even today, I blame myself that I hadn't decided to do something sooner. I needed to find out what was going on, and for lack of a better idea. My starting point was digging deeper into Dr. Helena's background. Her background was a carefully curated mystery. Her CV mentioned expertise in neurological plasticity, stress-induced cellular adaptation, performance enhancement through controlled environmental pressures, academic, sanitized, clinical. But I recognized something darker underneath. Slowly, everything that was happening around me was clicking into place. I continued my investigations quietly, looking up old research proposals, buried grant applications. Each document revealed breadcrumbs of a more sinister research trajectory. And what her CV didn't mention was far more interesting and far more hair-raising. Her research papers, published in top-tier medical journals, explored human performance optimization with a clinical detachment that bordered on the obsessive. Her earliest research, buried in less-known medical journals, explored human neuroplasticity under extreme stress. Not just psychological stress, but fundamental cellular-level transformation. How much could the human body, the human mind, adapt when pushed beyond conventional limits? It was at that point that the chilling truth started to truly dawn on me. The department's organic chemistry course was her living laboratory. And eerily, Dr. Helena's earlier words now held a completely different, more sinister meaning. In medical science, adaptation is survival. The human body is not a fixed system. It is a dynamic, responsive mechanism waiting to be optimized. I thought of Michael. "We are the future," Michael had told me one night, his eyes reflecting something ancient and inhuman. "We are what comes next." But I didn't know what came next, until that momentous day, the day I would last see my roommate forever. Michael's final moments were clinical, calculated. 3 days before the final exam, he came to knock on my door at precisely 3 a.m. His movements were too deliberate, too controlled. The fluorescent light cast him in sharp relief. I remember so clearly. His skin was almost luminescent, muscles subtly redefined, eyes reflecting something that wasn't entirely human. "I've been selected," Michael told me, his voice a perfect monotone. "Dr. Miller wants me in the lab." It was a proclamation that chilled my blood, and in a surreal moment of sudden clarity where everything seemed to slow down, I noticed all the small, horrific details. Michael's fingernails had changed, harder, slightly translucent. His pupils were dilated and almost too dark, a non-biological kind of dark. When he moved, and there was an unsettling precision, like a machine calibrating each muscle movement. "Selected for what?" I asked, my mouth dry like bone. Michael didn't answer, but there was a strange look in his eyes, despite its uncanny blackness. A look that almost seemed like a silent plea that I would never forget. It was as if he didn't answer because he couldn't. Not because he didn't want to. Then Michael handed me a folded piece of paper before walking away. The note contained a series of cryptic numbers and a partial access code to the university's restricted medical research archives. My hand shook as realization dawned, and I ran out the door after Michael, but he was already nowhere to be found. Not in the living room, not out in the main hallway. It was as if our encounter did not happen at all. Even though I wasn't the best in class, I hadn't made it to the country's top medical school for nothing, and I was soon able to crack the code Michael left me. The university archives were a labyrinth of bureaucratic history. Tucked away in the basement of the humanities building, rows of metal filing cabinets stretched like an endless industrial maze. Michael's numbers led me to a shelf tucked in one dark corner of the archives, where whether by design or not, the lights overhead were not functioning. The whole area was drowned in a pool of darkness. What I discovered in the files stashed in that dark corner numbed me to the core. Dr. Miller wasn't an isolated actor. She was part of a decades-long institutional program designed to create the perfect medical professionals. Archive grant proposals showed systematic funding from pharmaceutical companies, government research institutions, and private donors. The goal wasn't just academic excellence. It was human optimization at a cellular level. Preliminary research documents dated back to 1967 revealed the program's origins. Initial test subjects were military personnel, then medical students, now carefully selected undergraduate candidates. The university had a vested interest. Their medical school placement rates were unprecedented. Graduates dominated top residency programs. Research grants flowed like water. No one asked questions when the results were this spectacular. Dr. Miller's personal files told a more chilling story, things that I wasn't able to find on the internet. Her own doctoral research explored stress as a molecular trigger for human transformation. Not metaphorically, literally. She believed competitive environments could fundamentally restructure human biology. The transformation wasn't a side effect. It was the primary goal. Each selected student underwent a process of neurological and physiological restructuring, enhanced cognitive functions, improved cellular regeneration, synchronized neural pathways that allowed near telepathic levels of communication. The moment I copied the final document, I knew I was marked. In the days after that, campus security began following me. More sneakily at first, a car parked slightly too long near our dorm. Library study areas where someone always seemed to be watching. My academic advisor called me in, smiled too brightly, asked probing questions about my research interests, suggested I might benefit from some special opportunities in the medical research program. I understood the threat. Comply or disappear. The university's reputation was everything, and I had stumbled upon a secret decades in the making. My investigation revealed Michael's fate was already predetermined. The selected students weren't just high performers. They were test subjects in a long-term human optimization experiment. I began preparing, creating digital backups of all the documents I had copied, reaching out to investigative journalists. The institution was always one step ahead, but I had to keep trying. One day I came back to my room to find my computer completely wiped. Then my academic records were manipulated. Scholarship funding suddenly reviewed. As I sit here recounting this, it is now 2 weeks until the final exam, the ultimate selection mechanism. And I knew my choices are brutally simple. Become one of the 5, or become nothing.